from Germany, ultimately, but he's been teaching and is teaching, I guess now living permanently in New York, and he teaches in New Jersey at the Stevens Institute of Technology, where he's associate professor of philosophy. Are you also, in some sense, decanal? You have some leadership role in the humanities.
Some leadership role, yeah, something like that.
Is a dean of some sort?
Dean not yet, because I'm not tenured yet. So probably
so he will
force me to do this if I resist too much.
I see. So he
I'm getting tenured.
He has the responsibility without the honors of
exactly
of in some sense running and helping to lead the humanities curriculum at the Stevens Institute of Technology, which, for those of you who know it or don't know it, is a technology institute that has made an effort, very laudably, to keep a thriving humanities life alive for its technology students. And of course, there's few people more interesting for technology students to read than Martin Heidegger, one of the many. And Michael Steinman has certainly become and is becoming one of the interesting and important writers on Heidegger and others. He has edited a number of books and written other ones. He's the sole author of Die Offenheit des Sinns, Untersuchungen zu Sprache und Logik by Martin Heidegger. Is this translated, or you're just giving me the English translation?
I'm just giving you the English title.
The Openness of Sense, he calls it meaning. Investigations on language and logic in Martin Heidegger. He's also edited himself Martin Heidegger and the Greeks, writings on Martin Heidegger, of the Martin Heidegger Gesellschaft, Volume 8. And with Peter Sikora and Urban Wiesing, Altruism Reconsidered, Exploring New Approaches to Property in Human Tissue, which is, I guess, in preparation, or is out?
No, that already came out.
That already came out. You have to update your CV.
I know.
For someone who teaches in a technology university.
You would not imagine what kind of things don't work at it.
Yes, yes, I understand that. In any case, we're honored to have him here. For a number of you are studying Heidegger right now with me. Others of you are interested in other things. But welcome to BARD and to the Hannah Arendt Center, and we look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roger. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for bringing me up here to BARD. It's actually the first time that I'm visiting here. And we just had Roger over, I think, 3 weeks ago for a colloquium on political philosophy that was revisiting Hannah Arendt's Truth and Politics. I hope that we can, in one way or the other, continue our discussion with the group here that we have. I'm actually quite happy about the violin that's playing these more dissonant tunes while I'm talking, because the topic I'm talking about is it's a dissonant and difficult, and maybe the talk will also be dissonant and difficult about it. About Heidegger's politics, Heidegger's ideas of politics, and obviously also his engagement with certain political forces. In Being in Time, Heidegger refers to the, quote, phenomenal fact that mood brings Daseins before the death of its there, which stares at it in the way of an inexorable enigma, unquote. Human existence can well appear as an enigma to itself, because whatever humans do or think about themselves, they always have to come back to the fact that they are simply there, existing as the specific individual they are, without being able to choose it to be. The facticity of individual life presents the unsurpassable limit to our projects of self-interpretation. One can apply this phenomenal analysis to Heidegger's own life, especially to its political dimension. The fact that he sympathized with the National Socialist movement and even held the office of director of the University of Freiburg in the first year after the Nazis took power, from April 1933 to February 1934, cannot be denied. In one way or the other, every interpretation that even vaguely deals with the political dimension of his thought has to deal with this existential fact. And as much as one might desire otherwise, that this fact of existence is an enigma. Not because it is impossible to have a more or less clear image of what was going on. It is well established what Heidegger did. Facts sometimes can be disputed, but more or less we know what was going on. Facts are enigmatic because they cannot be deduced from any prior condition. There's nothing that explains why an existence is the way it is. In Heidegger's case, this means that nothing explains why he had to be involved with the Nazi movement. This is true both for his critics and for those who think that his work is worth being taken seriously. The latter have to deal with the fact that nothing in Heidegger's philosophy excuses the fact of his failed political engagement. Whether he was the greatest thinker of the 20th century or not, from our retrospective view, he still chose the wrong side. On the other hand, what makes his fact so puzzling is that he could have become someone else. There's no necessary link between his thinking and his political engagement. Based on work such as Being in Time, one does not have to become sympathetic to the Nazi movement. Heidegger could have stayed himself by keeping a critical distance to all politics. His choice is such an annoying enigma because not even he needed to force it upon himself. But the same is also true in dealing with his critics. Critics of Heidegger tend to identify his philosophy and politics. Emmanuel Faye's book is the latest and perhaps most radical example of this tendency. In trying to read Heidegger's philosophy as a Nazi philosophy, he attempts to establish a necessary link between the two. Being involved with the Nazi movement follows deterministically out of a certain disposition of thought. To do so, Faye has to misread Heidegger, which makes his contribution more of a political pamphlet than a serious analysis. But it also is obvious that he wants to eradicate the enigma of political engagement. If he could establish, one time for all, which kind of political thinking leads to a certain political choice, we could forever make sure that no one makes such choices again. Philosophers would forever be safe from failed political engagement. But evidently such attempt is flawed, as nothing will ever prevent even the greatest thinkers from having bad political preferences. So I would say that Faye, in a sense, tries to do away with the enigma of Heidegger's engagement by somehow creating a kind of necessary worldview out of which Heidegger couldn't have prevented becoming a Nazi. Talking about an enigma of this political engagement obviously should not be understood here as an excuse or as an attempt to somehow excuse what Heidegger did. We can, as I already said, we can show what happened in 1933. We know that it was his pretty bourgeois greed for reputation and influence that drove him to power, and we can also show his failure to engage humanely with the victims of the Nazis after the war. So my point is not in regard to Heidegger's personality, it is regard to the philosophers, and as philosophers I would say we have to accept this personal failure as it is. Whatever interpretation we choose, it will not be able to do away with it. And philosophers, as we all know, are great in trying to interpret facts in a way as to make them disappear as facts. And the following political choices and philosophical ideas ought to be seen in a mutual relation. None of the decisions made on either side forces the other to be in a certain way, but both sides inform and influence each other reciprocally. Heidegger became politically engaged as a philosopher, and the experiences he made had to leave a mark on his philosophy. Philosophy, on the other hand, gave meaning to his engagement. This way, the philosophical ideas can be understood in their more general significance. They are both linked to his personal failures and independent from them. The systematic problem this talk will deal with is the problem of identity. How did Heidegger think to be able to give a social and political identity to the Germans without the premises used by the nationalistic or racist discourses? How can there be the awareness of the purpose, or even how can be the awareness of the purpose or even the destiny of the German people without recurring to the arbitrary and meaningless facts of ethnicity, race, or culture? In other words, how can there be a truly philosophical foundation of a political and social identity? A foundation that would not require certain political forces to help philosophy do its job, but would initiate a certain form of politics from beyond the political realm. This is the systematic problem I want to lay out in regard to Heidegger. I want to show how he first failed in regard to achieving this goal in his, most of all in his 1933 speech on the self-affirmation of the German university. I then want to show in a second step how this failure is in a sense rooted in certain methodological premises of being in time, or at least how we can see that the political failure is reflected by certain premises of Heidegger's phenomenology. And in the last step I then want to sketch out how he transformed his thinking as to avoid the political problems he incurred in his earlier time. So the first part on the self-affirmation of the German university. As an example of political philosophy, Heidegger's writings can be read in a twofold way. To a lesser extent, they talk about political principles, without, however, reaching the level of a genuine political theory. Within the phenomenological and hermeneutical analysis of the structures of being, a theory of institutions or rights has no appropriate place. To a much greater extent, Heidegger's writings are political insofar as they entice a certain self-awareness which then achieves political relevance. A certain self-understanding is set in motion in and through the movement of the text. Phenomenology can be political insofar as it allows for a new orientation in the world we share with others. Heidegger's notorious speech about the self-affirmation of the German university is political in the second sense. It is meant as the attempt to create a new orientation not only for the university, but for the university as a center for the renewal of society as a whole. The speech, as we all know, was Heidegger's inaugural address, held on May 1933 at the inception of his service as rector-president of the University of Freiburg. It was a public event that gave him maximum exposure. Never before or after did he have the opportunity to appear in such political light. But the enticing character of his speech also makes for the specific vagueness it has. The text is certainly no collection of statements or a description of a concrete proposal or a plan. At best one could say that it is programmatic. But programmatic texts are not meant to be precise. They rather sketch out a future and call for an agreement to do whatever possible to let such future become real. Programmatic texts, in other words, are promises and exhortations whose truth value can hardly be assessed. If ever, truth will be proven by an outcome yet to reach. In a more philosophical way, one could say that they are meant to be performative. Whoever follows the movement of Heidegger's thought simply by the fact of doing so will have achieved a new orientation within the world. He will learn to see and understand himself differently. And if I state this in such a static way, it might sound strange, what he probably should have said. What he tries to do with this text is to take the listeners, the audience, let's say, on a way where they can feel a transformation just simply by following the lines of his thought. Heidegger's text moves through a series of what could be called phenomenological indications. They all start with a self-reflection of science and end in establishing a new decisiveness and Geschlossenheit of the German people. The text moves from science to the state, from knowledge and a commitment to truth to political engagement and a commitment to the community of the people. A rather particular symbiosis of science and politics takes place, which is only held together by the breadth of philosophical thought, which encompasses the particular sciences and prepares, in swinging from theory to practice and back, a political decision. Let me just briefly outline how this works. The text, in a sense, has to be read as one entire movement, and a movement which I said that starts from a reflection on science and ends with a political decision of the community. And as I also said, it is held together by philosophy's ability to be both theoretical and practical at the same time. So there's a series of, we could also call them equations or transformations, phenomenological transformations, which lead Heidegger from one point to the other. So he begins by talking about the self-reflection of those who constitute the university. This self-reflection, Selbstbesinnung, will lead to a self-affirmation, Selbstbehauptung, of the university, which will then lead to a will to essence as a will to science, Wissenschaft, which then eventually will be the people which know themselves in this thing. In this sense, the necessity, the emergency of science parallels the emergency and the necessity of this thing. And another of these equations goes as follows. He starts out with the uncertainty of knowledge. I will later on explain what this means. Talks about the greatest danger of a people in its historical moment. Then leads him to the idea of spirit, Geist, which is awakened by this danger. Spirit then creates the decisiveness, Entschlossenheit of the people. This creates the innermost excitation, the innermost force of the people. This eventually will build the community. Out of this community, leadership will arise, and out of the community, the best will be selected. They all will have a commitment to the community and a service, and the service ultimately will be threefold. It will be the service in work, in defense, and in knowledge. These are the notorious three Arbeitsdienst, Lehrdienst und Wissensdienst in Heidegger's work. And this is how the text moves from one to the other. So we start as scientists and we end up by servicing this thing. The question of identity is not mentioned directly in the text. Heidegger emphasized the fact that the political powers, later on Heidegger emphasized the fact that the political powers did not understand the real meaning of his speech. Indeed, it was criticized and even ridiculized as a sort of private national socialism. And Heidegger also emphasized that nowhere in the text the argument is based on the idea of race. The speech clearly addresses the German people. In a sense, it wants to create these people as a people, give them a new reason for its unity. But the missions of the Germans is described as one that concerns the Occident, the Abendland, as a whole. The Germans in Heidegger's text are not so much an isolated and privileged people, they are representative for the destiny of the Western world as a whole. It is so certainly easy to ironize such historical pathos. However, against the background of Nazi politics, Heidegger chose a rhetoric that is national but not nationalistic. And what is more, the German mission only reflects the first beginning of science, attributed to ancient thought. Heidegger's Germans appear as renewed, resurrected Greeks. And this was also ironized in the wider public, so someone said that after this speech, one doesn't really know whether one should read Plato or resort to arms. So, in a sense, both solutions were possible, or both reactions were possible. Obviously, there's a deep ambivalence that characterizes Heidegger's text. His argument is decisively ethnocentric, as it concerns the historic opportunity offered to the German people, and in a sense to the German people alone, and yet it is not based on the factual, that is, racial identity of the Germans. Heidegger's project is a politics of identity that is not based on the arbitrary and mostly biological traits that characterize the people, but culminates in a spiritual renewal. From its beginning, Heidegger saw the National Socialist movement in a twofold way, as a practical opportunity achieving a higher meaning. The movement was political and philosophical for him at the same time. This ambivalence then also can be found in retrospective comments. Heidegger, in a sense, never denied the basic legitimacy of the movement, but regrets the failure it presented compared to its own initial premises. In a sense, and it almost sounds as a joke, one could say that for Heidegger, the Nazis themselves spoiled the truth of the National Socialist movement. The movement could have been much greater, much more groundbreaking than it became under the rule of party politics. But let's take a look at this constellation from a more philosophical point of view. What allows for the spiritual self-affirmation of scientific professionals, that is, of university employees, is granted for Heidegger by the insight into the limits of all knowledge. This proceeds in 3 steps. The first step is to make clear that Heidegger can overcome the modern understanding of science as a multitude of specialized disciplines. Not only because the university can hardly be considered a unity anymore if one looks at a plethora of disciplines, most of which are completely isolated from each other. Also, each specialized discipline has an expertise, a little piece of truth of its own, while for Heidegger's science politics, truth lies beyond the realm of expertise. To see this point, each discipline has to see itself as a form of science, and science in turn has to see itself as a philosophical attitude. The university is brought back to its original unity, according to Heidegger, if all disciplines recognize their philosophical quest for truth. And it's just interesting to imagine this being brought up to a faculty council and being proposed to disciplines that are not philosophy. But this is how he thinks the foundations can be laid out. The second step then is to show that philosophy's truth is nothing else than the concealment of being. True science means, quote, to stand one's ground in the midst of the constant concealment of being as a whole, unquote. To stand one's ground not because of the certainty of scientific methods and principles, but precisely because there is no ground, no certainty to which scientific inquiry finally leads. Science has to face its own failure, and for Heidegger it is nothing else than the preparation to bring itself before its failure. Its essence lies in an attitude of questioning which reaches beyond every possible answer. But in the third and final step, this means that science reaches its ultimate focus and concentration precisely in this reflection on its limit. The failure of science keeps it, so to speak, awake and acute. Heidegger says it macht alles scharf. Science is thrown back on itself, or better, it is the process of being constantly and knowingly thrown back onto oneself. And in this awareness of its paradoxical capacity of knowing not to know, it finds the inner strength necessary for a renewed commitment, first to the scientific, then to the wider political community. The identity of the community is constituted by the encounter with the concealment of being, which denies every possible identity found in the relation to the world. The community lives in what Heidegger calls Weltungewissenheit, uncertainty of the world, or better, uncertainty of having a world, uncertainty whether there is a world. Identity is constituted precisely by the lack of an ultimate ground of identity. It is now clear in which sense Heidegger's politics is a politics with and without identity at the same time. Philosophy achieves a new foundation for the social and political identity of the German people by showing how it can become itself, renouncing to an ultimate ground for any identity. Identity emerges out of the philosophical openness to concealment and scientific failure. However, this philosophical interpretation of the political project is only one side of the coin. The other side is decidedly more problematic, as it entails certain political consequences that go counter to the philosophical intent. To show this, it is useful to see how Heidegger's speech mirrors certain phenomenological ideas that were at the basis of being and time. And this will be the second part of the talk. Now, to talk about being and time, and to see how the text has certain similarities with this constellation, one first has to start from the idea of death in being and time. Death has the systematic function in this work of bringing Dasein into its authentic form. Death is the possibility of the impossibility of being, It is the ultimate failure of any identity we give to ourselves. It is the missing ground, or as we might say, the missing substantiality of existence. But exactly in the face of its own death, Dasein grabs the particular existence it has to be. The missing ground reveals the radical singularity of any individual being. It has no ultimate reason to be in one way or the other, except for the fact of having to be in one particular way. There is no reason, one could say, and precisely this is the reason to exist as it is. Existence is the paradox of self-affirmation under the condition of self-denial. This is how death is understood very briefly in Being and Time. I think you see immediately how this relates to the idea of the concealment of being. What we experience as our individual death, as, let's say, the concealment of our possibility of being, is later then brought to a more fundamental level as being to the concealment of being as such. Death, however, then is systematically important because for the project of Being in Time, it is important to start from Dasein. The basic methodological condition of Heidegger's phenomenology of being is this. Whatever can be said about being only can be said if we clarify the point of view from which being is described. There's no ontology possible in the traditional sense. In a sense, no ontology at all. Heidegger's ontology, if ever, is a fundamental ontology. We might also say a post-traditional ontology. It cannot proceed and it cannot directly describe what being is. It cannot just simply start from a metaphysical tradition, although Heidegger seems to indicate in the very first pages of Being in Time that he just simply connects to this metaphysical tradition, but based on the premises of phenomenological thought, on the premises that whatever we describe, whatever we bring to the fore, has to be seen in an original way. Based on these premises, there can be no philosophy of being that is not in one way or the other linked back to a source of the phenomenality of being, which for this project is Being in Time. Is Dasein. For the project of Being Time, it is Dasein. And this then leads to a certain ambivalence of Being and Time. This ambivalence lies in the fact that a philosophy of human existence is developed here that is meant to be a philosophy of being as such. Dasein, human Dasein, is only the point of departure, but the book does nothing else than clarifying this very point of this departure. To access being directly in itself is not allowed. Being in Time, hence, is a philosophy that seems an anthropology, although it wants to be something deeper, something it cannot achieve without being an anthropology first. Obviously, there's much to say about these methodological problems in Being in Time, and as you all know, Being in Time has not been finished. In a sense, Being in Time is a methodological problem, and Heidegger always read it this way in his later years. Although he said the intention was clear, it was clear that what I wanted to show in this book, the language I had and the methods I had couldn't lead me to the point I wanted to go. It couldn't overcome the tension that he had to start from an anthropology which didn't want to be, which didn't have to be an anthropology at the end. But what does this mean for the political project of the speech on the self-affirmation of the German university? At first glance, this seems very far from this more mundane political issue. But the same structure, I would argue here, can be found in the speech as in Being in Time. Identity is restored through the lack of identity. But the lack of identity is only recognized if the German people concentrate on the inner conditions of their existence. It needs a certain disposition to be even able to acknowledge the missing ground of all identity. That is, it needs identity to lose identity. And this is the same structure we see in Being in Time. It needs the whole structure of individual Dasein brought before its individual death, affirmed in this situation by its individual conscience, and only then, based on this individual experience, the sense of being as such for Heidegger opens up. So the missing ground of identity opens up once we affirm the authentic identity of ourselves. With this point we enter the most disturbing layer in Heidegger's text. The best among the people, he says, have to be selected. And he wanted to become rector, he later will say, in order to keep all inept forces and persons away. It needs, obviously, a special personnel in order to realize the university's mission. However, as he also will lament, he never was able to have simply the best mind and spirits gathered to fulfill his missions. He wanted them and he needed them because, based on the model of being in time, it needs the individual experience to come to the experience of being. And then, in a sense, just more of a personal footnote for Heidegger, the real justification for his engagement with the Nazi movement was to pick out the right people who would then be able to purify it and to bring it to the level he thought it should be. And the way he failed just simply lied in the inability of people to see this deeper dimension. To be fair, we know that for Heidegger the best were not limited to party members or Aryans. His conflict with the Nazi authority was sparked by his refusal to dismiss certain colleagues of his. Heidegger, who came from a modest rural family, certainly was as meritocratic as one can be. And yet, requiring a collective effort of a chosen group of people, to which many of the Jewish colleagues could no longer belong at that time, means that Heidegger, willingly or not, had to resort to a rather simple and straightforward politics of identity. A certain German identity had to be established, to be then dissolved in the face of scientific uncertainty. The philosophical project required a quite mundane political organization. It required no less than the repressive and authoritarian politics of the new Nazi government. Without the sheer power of the new political rule, Heidegger could never have thought of a collective effort which would then provide the luxury to transcend all narrow political aims. It took the very concrete and often violent power of the party to push the university to a realm where all science gives up its power to the overwhelming concealment of being. Repressive politics had to become the means to achieve a liberating philosophical insight. Ultimately, this tension could not be reconciled. Again, we have to concede that Heidegger's project was not directly repressive. However, he had to rely, at least indirectly, on repression, on the fact that the National Socialist movement had already begun to organize society, to shape it in a new way. The dirty politics initiated by the Nazis were meant to be disregarded in favor of the dignity of the philosophical renewal, but at the end, they undermined and destroyed the philosophical project itself. Now, how did Heidegger react to this failure? The failure became very soon clear when he was more or less pushed out of office in April 1934, again because of personal politics, because of the ways he renounced to putting certain deans in charge that were in the interest of the Nazis. Heidegger thought that they should be put in office based on merit. So it became clear that he could not realize the agenda that he had. But how did he react to it? How did he personally and philosophically develop a solution to the insight that an agenda as the one that he had could not be realized? Well, philosophically, the only solution was to find a foundation of identity that would not require the prior repression of inept forces. That is, he had to define community in a way that would not require the collective effort of a chosen group that already has a certain identity, but would need to unleash the event or an event out of which all identity has to emerge. The following will show what this means. So I'm coming now to the last part, which is very briefly devoted to Heidegger's work after 1933. Heidegger's later work, which has found its most prominent expression in the contributions to philosophy, the Beiträge, written in 1936, has often been seen as a reaction to his political involvements. The later writings can be subsumed under the idea of the term. I'm repeating this just a little bit. Please excuse me if this is something you all already know. The term means that instead of thinking being in relation to one exceptional being, that is, to human Dasein, it rather has to be thought in and out of itself. Philosophy has to start from being in its absoluteness, not from a particular being. Only then can it be understood in its original character and singularity. Being, thought in and out of itself, is named Ereignis, which can be translated either literally as event or as enowning. Enowning, a term coined for Heidegger's idea of Ereignis. Enowning means that being lets everything be what it is, brings it into what is its own. It is the first and decisive origin of every ontological determination, that is, of every determination that characterizes something as being, as existing, and as being this and that. This also means that the discipline of ontology is insufficient to explain what its own founding notion is. Being, according to Heidegger, cannot be taken for granted, but has to be understood from out of its origin. Naming it Ereignis, event, and owning means to ask beyond the obvious fact of being. And you see how this relates to the earlier project of a fundamental ontology, which already was a non-ontology or a foundation of ontology, the thinking of the Ereignis, the inventor and owning, obviously, just continues this project of giving a foundation to the most fundamental term of being. In a sense, giving a foundation to the foundation, giving an origin to the origin, going back to a point where we almost cannot say anymore where we are. But that's the movement, the continuous movement of the late Heidegger, to continuously say, push thinking towards an origin beyond the terms and concepts that we think to be adequate for what we talk about when we call something being. Which also echoes obviously his theory of science and philosophy in the 1933 speech on the self-affirmation of the university, insofar as the truth of all knowledge is the concealment of being the truth of all knowledge is, that there can't be any truth that we can hold on to. But coming back to the more political questions, for many critics this move to ask beyond every particular being and even beyond being itself has been seen as an attempt to avoid the political with respect to which Heidegger so miserably failed. Heidegger, many have said, fled from social and political concerns into the pure and safe realm of absolute being. Such criticism is not entirely wrong. What makes Heidegger's later work, as much as his personal attitude, so problematic is the fact that he refuses to engage in a serious political discussion, that he refuses to engage with National Socialism from a human point of view. He rather points at that which lays beyond all human points of view. However, even the later works are still political and can be read as a direct comment on his earlier thought. We have to remember that political thinking for Heidegger does not mean to talk about politics, but to let thinking go through a movement which transforms its basic orientation and so achieves political relevance. His many lectures on Hölderlin, for example, held after 1933, are political in this second sense. In them, Heidegger tries to then transform German identity by giving it another language to think about itself, and by relying on the performative force of poetic language. In this sense, I want to argue that he does not give up the political dimension of his earlier thought, but rather tries to put it right. Heidegger never gave up the idea that there has to be some kind of revolution. A new beginning has to be made that forever propels us out of the dominion of traditional metaphysics. Modernity for him is not able to overcome its nihilistic tendencies by itself, but needs to transcend itself into a fresh start of human orientation in the world. It is safe to say that Heidegger was longing for such revolutionary beginning long before the Nazis gave him the opportunity of being part of such renewal. I haven't mentioned this earlier, but I think it's a very important motive, and whenever one studies Heidegger's work, the idea of origin and beginning is just everywhere. From very early on, he wants to find the beginning, the origin of the movement of individual existence. He then looks at the ecstatic negativity of time in being in time, meaning at the way in which time emerges as a pure negativity. And Ereignis, obviously, as event, is just another term for this dimension of a start, a beginning, an origin, a revolution, we might say. And some have said, and I think they're right in doing this, that Heidegger was a revolutionary thinker. He was a right-wing revolutionary, and so he was fascinated with the Nazis because they presented the opportunity for an origin, for a new start. And maybe this was for him the most important part about them. In his later works then, the idea of beginning, of Anfang, is often presented in a more as a metaphysical way, as a new beginning of the history of philosophy and of being. So one can hardly see how this has any political dimension. But if we see that the most important point in the Nazi movement was that it started, that it gave Germans the opportunity to have a new beginning, to come back to their origins, then Heidegger's later continuous reflections on the Anfang of the Occident, of Occidental thinking, have to be read against this background. So the question then is, how does he transform political thinking in a way as to avoid the problems he encountered in the early 30s? What kind of political solution, or at least what kind of political description can he give that might lead to a different revolution, a revolution that is not based on the repressive acts of certain groups or power? One such solution I just want to very briefly mention and bring up here as an example. You can find it in one of the lectures he gave on Hölderlin, and I'm referring here to Hölderlin's Easter, the Danube, which Heidegger interpreted in the summer semester of 1942. But you can also see it in his important interpretation of Germanian, and obviously in all other texts referring to Hölderlin. Easter, the river Easter, the Greek name for the Danube, that's the title of Hölderlin's poem, that's the title of Heidegger's lecture. He starts with the idea of what he calls in the Stromdichtung, stream poetry, river poetry, and it might translate into English, the poetry based on great rivers. The equivalent would be the Mississippi poetry, or the Hudson poetry, if this exists. The stream is mentioned and is important for Hölderlin, Heidegger thinks, because it brings humans into what is their own, its eigene. It gathers a country around it, it gathers a civilization around it. And by doing so, it gives humans who do not have a home in this world, in this being, they give them the opportunity to have a home, to find something like a place on which they can dwell. Dwelling then becomes a very important concept in these later works. And Heidegger, in the course of this lecture, also refers to Sophocles and the second chorus of the Antigone, which mentions the many uncanny capacities that humans have, and among the many wonderful things, also the polis, the community, we might say, or the state that humans are able to create. And this is the point of which I want to focus. The polis, in the Greek sense, Heidegger then says in 1942, is not political, but it is the origin and the possibility of our politics. And it is certainly not, as he says, a state, it's not an institution, it's not a certain system of laws, but it is a place. It is an open place in which the humans can gather and be prepared for a decision. The polis is, it's not at all what it could have been in the 1933 lecture, a state-like entity where we all do service for it in one way or the other. But it really is just a, there's no other word for it than place on which we come together. A place which is mirrored and confined and defined by the streams floating around. So this is just a brief outlook on what Heidegger does in his later years. Just to give you an example and not just talk about the abstract concepts. The difference to the earlier speech, and so I'm coming to an end now, the difference to the earlier speech and the self-affirmation of German university is obvious here. In the rectoral speech, all emphasis is put on the historical moment of decisiveness in Schlossenheim. The speech evokes an experience of time, the heightened experience of a new beginning in time, or even of a new beginning of time, of a time of the people. This experience is made by the German people in accepting and affirming their metaphysical homelessness, that is, in accepting their fundamental ignorance before the concealing of being. Thrown back onto themselves, as we have seen, the people gathers its forces to throw itself into a new beginning. As we have seen, this experience is not possible without the people being forced into the unity of a national subject. Only the political organization of the new national politics brings all individuals into the community that is needed for the specific temporal experience to occur. Compared to this, the later conception of the pre-political meaning of the polis does not require humans to achieve this gathering and uniting by themselves. Rather, they are gathered by their common exposure to being's openness and not its concealment. For this, the shift from the heightened experience of time to a heightened experience of place is of the utmost importance. The fact that the German people now finds itself in a certain place, determined as the in-between of the great rivers of Danube and Rhine, and brought to become aware of themselves through the language of Hölderlin, takes away the burden of creating the identity through the impact of political forces. Rather, the identity now emerges from the encounter with conditions that are beyond human influence. Identity, in other words, is now much more an experience, not so much the possession of a certain authentic moment of life. It is something that a people encounters in reflecting on what it is without having to force itself into a certain decisive attitude. And I see this as the most important shift from the earlier description of how a people should understand itself to the later one. Obviously, still the idea of a revolution applies. Even then, if we listen to Hölderlin just well enough and become aware of the openness of being, we might be able to transform ourselves. So Heidegger never gives up the hope in this transformative force of poetry or philosophy as it reads poetry, but it is not that we can be forced into achieving the attitude necessary for this. What we see then in Heidegger's philosophy, to conclude, is the difficult relation that philosophy has to politics. For philosophy, politics is always more than politics. That is, it is more than actions and projects involving power, interest, and influence. Rather, it is the realization of certain ideas about the unity and purpose of a social entity, a city, a people, or a state. But how can these ideas be preserved if they need power to hold this way? And how could there be a power that is higher than political power? Heidegger's late philosophy is the attempt to find within the political a power that transcends the political, to find in human existence an openness where it is exposed to what is more than just human. In his collection Mindfulness, Besinnung, written in 1938 and 33, he even introduces a term that otherwise cannot be easily found in his political thought. because being the condition of all freedom. And whoever reads Heidegger's political thoughts doesn't find much about freedom and liberty. But freedom, as it is stated here in Heidegger's sense, is not our personal freedom, but rather the freedom from ourselves. Only if we are not bound to ourselves, not encapsulated in our subjective way, we can be free. In his early involvement with the national social politics, he must have sensed how such freedom got lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael, thank you very much. There's a lot. I mean, this was great, and there's a lot in it. I mean, the essence of the question I want to ask, which is going to be a little different, is how much you think the rector address is actually is something that should be philosophically taken seriously in Heidegger. You know, you talked at the beginning a little bit about how at times, you know, Heidegger keeps trying to bring the German people together, and yet you also later said, well, he's not really trying to bring the German people together; it's part of the Abendland. But so in the Hölderlin text that you referred to, he's talking about the Greek polis not as as an ethos, as an Aufenthalt, which is something we were discussing today amongst some of us earlier today. So that politics becomes an ethics for him much more than it is as a politics. It's clear that he thinks such an ethos is lost, right? And this is the system that you brought up, and the structure you brought up, that the only way to, in a sense, create a new politics is to people to recognize the danger in the loss of a politics, the loss of a polis, in the danger, and that we can't will such return to politics, because that's precisely the kind of technical thinking that that would show that we haven't yet realized the loss of an ethos and the rise of technical thinking. And so I guess the question is, you know, was there a time? How serious, except for the rector address, in Heidegger's text, do you find a philosophical program for the attempt to create an identity, as opposed to simply to say, we have to wait? Now, that is the move of the Beiträge, right? But it's been there all along in a certain way. It's radicalized in the Beiträge. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how big is the turn in your telling? Was there ever was there an attempt in Heidegger to think about politics in a different way in the earlier writings?
Yeah, so this is a couple of questions. Coming back to the rectoral address, you're certainly right that one could easily dismiss it and say this is just a political pamphlet in a sense, meant for public purposes, so we don't have to take it seriously. I don't think that we should do this, because, as I said, it was just a very prominent moment in his time, maybe the most prominent moment that he ever achieved, and he, in a sense, brings in all his philosophy, as he always does in his public speeches, in a very condensed way, so it's not unfolded, it is, in a sense, not even shown or justified what he says, but the ontology, his thinking of being is clearly there.
Yeah.
And it is the astonishing fact of someone thinking that one could come up with a very complex idea of being and present this at such an occasion to a political public, and then even expect people to understand it, and then even to follow it. So even if they understand it, let's assume they understand it, would they even follow it? And so I think we have to take this attempt of being a philosophical leader of the sciences and the scientific disciplines just very seriously. Jaspers made this very also funny, ironic comment about about Heidegger, which goes back to the first sentences where he says that the leaders, the Führer, also have to be led, and so you want to be the leader of the leader, you want to be the Führer of the Führer. But in a sense, that's what he wanted to be, and I think we cannot really understand what's going on after that if we don't see that how much he actually wanted to achieve at this moment. So I would take him seriously there. If he was realistic, I would certainly deny.
But is that consistent with his philosophy even at that time? The idea that one could lead and thus will to bring about the kind of return to a homeland that he is seeking?
Well, first of all, in a scientific way, I would say yes, that's what he always thought, with the primacy of the question of being. So from very early on, you see this in his Habilitationsschrift. He thinks that being is the most fundamental term, and if we explain this term, we might not be able to define it, but if we explain it, then we have the foundation of all knowledge, meaning the foundation of all sciences. So, yeah, in a sense, this was maybe the last strong foundational program of philosophy in the 20th century, based on Husserl's phenomenology, and then there's the Greek reformulation of it. So that's in a scientific way, or in the sense of a philosophy of science and a philosophy of the sciences as disciplines, he always had the idea that philosophy had to lead. Now, in a practical sense, well, again, you find this already in Being in Time. You find the running into death as a transformative moment, where you then choose how you want to proceed, where you choose, that is famous passages where he says you have to choose your generation, so the people to whom you belong, and that will be the group that you act with, and that will remember you and welcome you, and so on and so forth. So already Being in Time, and in very short remarks, some people have tried to identify the later involvement with the Nazis and so forth. So you can see a certain social dimension even in Being in Time. The other point is obviously how much of a political thought is it if we just wait? How can waiting be a political attitude? The driver who drove me into Bard College and was waiting for something to change in politics. And in a sense, maybe politics is all about waiting. So this could be a larger discussion about waiting for something to change, dealing with promises, hope, outlooks, programs, and so on and so forth. But for Heidegger, we could maybe say that, in a sense, waiting is already being there. You wait. Yeah, for what do you wait? I mean, being is concealed. All you can hope for is that you even recognize the concealment of being, because most of the time we forgot that being is concealed. So what can happen to us is that we become aware of how much we lack a ground for any certainty or science, or even any kind of identity that we have. And this awareness of a missing ground, this is the identity that we have. So out of that, it emerges, and there has to be an identity that is characterized by the danger that he talks about, by the polemos, the fight. It's in a sense an identity that's always on the verge of collapsing, of being lost again, that always needs to be refound. In a sense, Heidegger and let me put it that way. You don't find a theory of institutions in Heidegger. You don't find a theory of nation building, of laws, but you find a theory of politics as movement, in a sense of constant movement.
And is it? What I think is really interesting is your idea of identity as an experience. So it's individual experience, if I understand it correctly.
In the 20s, certainly yes, but it shifts to a collective experience.
In his later work.
In his later work, yeah, certainly in the early 30s with...
But isn't it the experience of thinking in his later work?
Well, in his much later works, yes. Let's say maybe his middle works, if you to say Being in Time is is the culmination of the early period, and then maybe, to be more precise, the middle period of the 30s, going on to the mid-40s, and I would say the later thinking is the mid-40s and following. So again, talking about the later Heidegger, in a sense, not too precise, and probably say the middle Heidegger, right? Yeah, but why does he read Hölderlin? I mean,
Why does he read Hölderlin?
yeah, I mean, think, would you teach a class just with one poem by Hölderlin and drive your students crazy by going line by line with every day?
Of course.
That's what we do.
I'm teaching them one essay right now.
Yeah, okay.
Are there, yeah, Joe?
I want to ask about your formulation where you describe being in time as an anthropology that wants to be more than an anthropology. And I guess I see a couple of reference points for this. That, of course, the beginning of being in time has a kind of, if it's an anthropology, it's a disavowal of anthropology. Arendt also has a similar gesture in the beginning of The Human Condition, where she says only God could say from the outside what man is. And so these kind of idealist, broadly speaking, conceptions of anthropology would be very different than, say, Arnold Galen, who says man is a certain way because he can't defend himself, therefore he doesn't have an essence and can change. But that's a different kind of non-essence because it's physically based than the philosophical kind. So I just wanted to ask you, how then is the anthropology that you see in there necessary for any kind of thinking that's based in existence, or has an existential basis, or is it completely unavoidable? Is it that just that any kind of philosophy has to have some start from man to disavow it? I'm also thinking of our work on humanism.
Yeah. Well, I call it anthropology just to highlight the problem that Heidegger thought this work had, and also to refer to the misunderstandings that for Heidegger occurred with the work. Obviously, it would be more precise to call it a philosophy of existence, so an existential philosophy. But doing a philosophy of existence by analyzing the structures of existence, well, means to analyze the structures of man, of a human being. And what else is this than anthropology? He talks about the human being, of human Dasein. And so it can be read and understood as an anthropology. And Heidegger struggled a lot with the fact that his work was received as such. He makes these remarks that obviously this is not a complete anthropology, these are just some outlines that might be necessary for a future anthropology to be developed. But this also recognizes that it is one in a certain sense. It's very practical, it deals with intersubjectivity, it deals with the temporal notion of humans, the idea of Sorge, how we relate to different things, talking about curiosity. So, yeah, it is a description of the human, which was not meant to be a description of the human. So, or the human was just a stepping stone for something else. For Heidegger, to your question whether all philosophy has to begin from man, I would say that he really struggled with methodological problems. And this became clear to me when, in regard to Hans Gadamer's reaction to being in time. It always puzzled me in the beginning that Gadamer didn't like being in time. There's a certain, this is a person I wrote my dissertation with, Günter Kiegel, who was a student of Gadamer, also somehow had some problems with being in time, with the whole structure of the book, the prominence of death as this very emphatic existential experience. And if one looks at it from the eyes of Gadamer, who knew the Heidegger's early philosophy before being in time, in the early 20s, and who was fascinated with this intense teacher who could really captivate his audience, had his followers. then the question is, why was he so disappointed with him? And maybe the answer could be that Heidegger never really was able to write any books. If you think about it, Being in Time is a fragment, so he didn't finish it. He published then a couple of lectures, but about the lectures he says they are exoteric, they are meant to be read by the public, they are not what I really do. And he has these different volumes that we have now of notes and manuscripts, so Gesamtausgabe, complete works, 65 and onward, many collections, which are sometimes very intense and fruitful, sometimes also very repetitive, and are not really books. And then he has a lot of collections of essays. But in a sense he struggled with the big academic form of a book and bringing the idea of a philosophy of being, which is not traditional ontology, but fundamental ontology, so the critical ontology, bringing this into a form in which it can be communicated to the scientific public, in which it can be justified and proved that these are necessary steps that lead to this understanding of being. I think this was a terrible challenge for him, and he avoided this challenge after the experience of Being in Time as much as he could. We don't really have books on the traditional sense from Heidegger. And so his attempt, I would say, was to cover his back, to develop very meticulously the methodological conditions under which we can say that the sense of being is time. And in a sense, the whole purpose of these 480 pages is just to bring us to this point where we can say, well, if we ever talk about being, we have to talk about the sense that being has, and the sense of being is time. And this we see in the whole analysis of Dasein. So Being in Time then is a very, in a certain sense, a hyper-methodological treatise where every step is very carefully explained and has to prove something that follows to it. So in a sense, also then the freshness and the intuitive character of his early philosophy gets lost to a certain degree. So this was a long-winded way of saying that the beginning with Dasein, in a sense, was the problem of how to begin, how to have a philosophy that talks about being in a, let's say, non-traditional way, a non-arbitrary way, that really shows us being as a phenomenon. And this is why he thinks he has to begin from human Dasein. But the book then was received as being only about human Dasein and not about being.
Yeah, the fascinating talk, and I really appreciate it. It's been some years since I've read my Heidegger, so I'm not fresh, and I'm trying to recall. But this shift from Being in Time to the middle or later, Nach der Wende, two words come to mind that may or may not, and you've already mentioned one of them, have something to do with the politics. Entschlossenheit, with Being in Time, which is this active challenge, almost a duty to decide. And I'm trying to keep Sartre out of the picture, but you have to make this decision. And then later, Abgeschiedenheit, which I know more from a Meister Eckhart, an Aristotelian tradition. And if we had time, I'd love to go into Heidegger and Aristotle on Das Dasein, and where, talking about, okay, so this being that he's doing that's not part of the tradition, how similar is it, though, to what Aristotle was doing? But Entschlossenheit and Abgeschiedenheit, is it too simplistic to put the change in the political orientation around, just at least use those as two opening points for talking about the change and the...
Why not? I mean, yeah, I think it certainly makes sense. And what do you mean about? Did you also mean Gelassenheit or?
Well, Gelassenheit is what that's the term that Heidegger uses, right?
Yeah, the term he gets from Meister Eckhart. Yeah, well, in a certain sense, Entschlossenheit, which is translated in English as decisiveness, I would say was meant to be something like Gelassenheit, which means this being, I don't know, what's the translation of Gelassenheit? Being
Letting go.
Letting
Letting
go,
go.
yeah.
Letting be.
Or letting be, yeah. Which is this Meister Eckhart's idea that we find God if we let go of God. So if we let him forego, he comes to us.
Detachment.
And then we detach. But in a sense, even Entschlossenheit was meant this way. And Entschlossenheit is the opposite of concealment, as if when we are, in a sense, it means to open up. Verschlossen would be locked up, concealed. Entschlossen would be, yeah, again, opened up. So, in a sense, the English translation, the decisiveness, puts a more subjectivistic.
It's often translated as resoluteness.
No, resoluteness.
Right.
Yeah.
To resolve, well, which has problems too.
Mm.
It doesn't catch the unclosedness. Of
The unclothing, yeah,
Entschlossenheit.
that's the word I was looking for. In effect, but in a sense, the German readers didn't catch it either, so
As is often the case.
as is often the
And
case.
systematically being in time too. He was presenting it in a place where it wasn't time to, for Gelassenheit, it was a time for a decision.
No, it's a time to.
Yeah, time for decision, which in a sense is but also then well, it's a decision where you come back being, as I said, repelled from from death,
Right.
so from the possibility of your own impossibility, and then you have to choose something in the world. So you, in a sense, you begin anew. So it has definitely has more of a subjective, let's say, counterpart in a human decision which comes out of death. And in this sense, a subjective element is there. So you could also characterize it by this, let's say, this swinging, which is the idea of time, that you run towards the absolute future of your death. You are thrown back into what you are, and out of that you come to the present where you make a decision. So this moment of the decision is in the relation to the present is there. And let's say the aspect of Gelassenheit in the sense of letting go is there, the future aspect of death. So we could probably say that while Heidegger still has more of a subjective element in the earlier thought, he in a sense gets rid of them and in the later conceptions and focuses much more on the passive and the opening character.
And so how does that deal with the question of identity? Because I mean, because I see that, somehow in the beginning where he's making an active, an attempt to seek, at least in the Rector address, identity, the German identity, whereas in the latter, it's only going to be through poetry and letting being be. But
it still is there. I mean, the term identity I brought into the interpretation. So in my term, you don't find identität. It's a term that Heidegger uses here. I thought it might be useful to somehow describe the project. So, which is always the problem, that if you interpret Heidegger, you find your own words.
Right.
If you just follow his words,
Right.
you don't get too far. But what he always holds on to is the idea of what is our own or the own. So you find this already in what is translated as authenticity in English, which is Eigentlichkeit, becoming eigen, becoming your own, what you truly are for yourself, one's ownness. Yeah. So this is already a term in being in time, and it somehow then translates into this idea of Ereignis, which literally means event, but then the way Heidegger plays with the etymology and the literal meaning is that it has something to do with becoming, achieving the ownness, becoming what you are, what is your own. And in this sense, this idea of the own, of what you own and what owns you and where you belong.
Eigentum.
The eigen, yes, and also being then, so in different ways. Then so the idea of property, you can find a very complicated hermeneutic of property relations in this sense. It's so we are owned by being, and therefore we come into our own as belonging to being. So the Heidegger, the middle Heidegger to be precise, and then the later, does a lot by explaining our relationship to being in these terms of property and ownership and belonging. So in this sense, identity, there's a concern for identity, for who you are and what you are, where you belong to. It's never really given up. I would say that this, he redefines it, he clarifies it, he wants to come to a better solution. And Hölderlin then is the answer to Hitler. To put it in this, we shouldn't be that simple, but yeah. But it's I would say it's still the same problem that he's related to.
Yeah, you mentioned that the being in time is not completed, and it's not completed because of linguistic and methodological problems with continuing it. So I think we talked a little bit about method, but as for language, I mean, that's something that I've been interested in for a while. What is it? What are the essential characteristics of language that sort of impeded this continuation of the book? And is it? I assume it's not just German. I assume it's language as it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not completed. Heidegger made an attempt to complete it, an attempt that he burned. So we have some later lectures which can be read as being the final part of being in time. But we can never be sure, because there's also a difference between the genre of the lectures, the public lectures, and the book. So I would be very cautious in taking, for instance, the problems of phenomenology from summer semester 1927 as being the part of being in time that we don't have. So I think we can't be it can't be that simple. Now, your question of language here. Well, Heidegger said that language didn't get through. That's what he says in the contributions to philosophy. So he wanted to reach a level where he talks about being as being, but didn't have the language. Yeah, why is this so? I think the answer probably would go like this. Heidegger's idea of being is that we should go to the origin of being, to where being emerges, to where it really starts to be what it is. Being in itself is a term we get from the tradition, but we have to understand what it originally means. Now, understanding what it originally means is something we cannot describe, we cannot talk about it, we cannot have a definition of it, because the definition of an origin is already away from the origin, it's already distant from the origin. So I would say that the problem of speaking about being was for him that you have to speak out of being. You have, in a sense, you have to speak being's language. You have to enact being in your language. And this is what we see in the manuscripts, the contributions of philosophy in the other volumes, 65, 66. I would see them as, let's say, exercises in language, where he tries to speak in a way as to show how the event of the ereignis or the event of being unfolds, to make this unfolding happen in language, I would say. Not talking about it, but letting it happen. In a sense, I also think very similar to what Hegel says in Introduction to the Phenomenology about the speculative sentence, that if you have a sentence moving towards from the subject to the predicate, you have transformed the subject into the predicate, meaning that the sentence is not, again, a statement about something, it's the transformation of something into something else. And I would say that Heidegger is thinking maybe along the same methodological premises. At least I would say that this is a way we can make sense of many things that he says in his middle and later works. If you take them as statements, they sound ludicrous. But you really have to take them as movements, as ways to transform your thought.
But isn't that even in being in time before the apophantic Ausstructure? Before there's already that anticipation of, if we're going to get to the origin of the way that we talk about being, we're not going to be saying much, or we're going to be doing poetry, or we're going to
I don't think I don't think it is poetry. It is movement. So if you think of that, for instance, and you're right, you find this already in Being in Time, in the ecstatic conception of time, with the three ecstasies, future, past, and present. And the point is obviously not that we say that there are three ecstatic dimensions of time. That's trivial. But the idea of ecstasis is that you have this swinging movement from present to the past and then into the future, so as a whole. And this is what we already have to think in Being in Time. I wouldn't say that this is poetry.
I'm talking later when he moves into
Yeah.
Holderlin, and it's the process of not saying but showing, and you're...
Yeah. But I think he also tries to go through this process in philosophical terms. Maybe that's... No, not maybe. I would say that this is the way he transforms phenomenology. In the sense that phenomenology, and you always see this in Husserl, in the sense, in phenomenology you see how things develop out of each other. So for instance, when Husserl describes the horizon of intentionality, so I see something, but I could also see, I don't see the backside, but I know that I could have some related intuitions that show me the backside of the thing, and then beyond that I have a broader horizon of certain perceptions which I haven't actualized, but I could move into them. So he describes the idea of consciousness as this moving focus, where certain things come potentially into our view, and they shift out of the view, certain things are highlighted, others not. That's already a very dynamic idea of how we perceive the world. I mean, that would be the point where you can see where Heidegger develops his own dynamic thinking, his own dynamic phenomenology. So I would be cautious to call it poetic. Because if you say it's poetic, then in a certain sense you block off certain, let's say certain links to phenomenology and to...
I wasn't asserting that he's doing poetry, but his interest in...
Sure, definitely, sure.
And looking to the poet as...
No, definitely,
as
you're
his
right.
philosophy returning to its origins, and this is where being is going to speak more clearly, as opposed to the highly, Germanic system of the Hegel or their consummation.
Definitely. Sure. No, you're definitely right.
He does think that thinking is deep.
In a dialogue to each other. I wouldn't say it's the same.
Denken heißt deep.
Heißt, nicht ist.
Yeah, it's not the same. It needs to go along with poetry, or to read poetry and to understand what it means.
Doesn't essential thinking say things? I mean, essential thinking has to say things in the way that poetry says things. And poetry has to think in the way thinking says things. I think there's no.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm reluctant to say yes.
Okay.
Because
I can only push you so far.
No, you can push me. There are certainly times where Heidegger comes very close to that, and some of his poems actually try to achieve that. I think we can all agree that his poems are not the strongest, not the strongest work. But then there are also which I would emphasize, the passages in his interpretation of Hölderlin, where he actually points at the difference between the thinker and the poet, and how they mutually highlight what they do, but are not the same. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think philosophy would be bad poetry if you tried really to be
I'm not trying to say that poetry is philosophy or that philosophy is poetry. It's that those are the philosophy and poetry are the two things that can.
No, that's okay. Sure.
We're very short on time.
No, and that come together in, let's say, original language. So in this sense, I fully agree to you, sure.
May I quote Nietzsche?
We'll let
let
Bill end with quoting Nietzsche.
Because he quotes Pindar, the poet I love the most. I love a poet who can think, he says. A Pindar or a Leopardi. In other words, the poet whom Hölderlin adored and followed most, Pindar, or the other great effulgence of transcendent romanticism in a European language, Leopardi.
It is, I mean, it is interesting how you set up you begin with science, and that the identity in the community is supposed to be found through the scientific experience of the failure of science. And yet, in the 1930s, where Heidegger is most concerned with this community, the work that you don't mention, and the work that most is about the search for a community, is the origin of the work of art. And that I would have thought that if anywhere in Heidegger's work one were to seek politics, one that he disavows in the 40s for sure. But in the 30s, if there's a politics, it seems to be in his thinking about art, less about science. But maybe is that?
Well, yeah, but it's already a later work, so it's in a sense it's already post 1933, in a sense post the attempt to be philosophical leader. I would say this already introduces and then the earth is also important. It also, in a sense, it also already introduces a thinking that also shifts away from the moment of a experience in time, of time, that was provided by the National Revolution, to an experience of place and the world, and how, sure, there's much more to say about the years after.
Okay. Well, we have to let Michael eat some dinner. Otherwise, the restaurants will all close. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to Michael.